Hey everyone, welcome to the Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast YouTube channel. So, we're going to do a little recap on what happened in week 4. We're going to do first an overview of what happened in the actual games themselves, the scores and everything else, and also what that looks like as far as where the standings have taken us. And then I'll go into talking a little bit about some of my thoughts from each game. Some of it turned out to be a little bit surprising, but not really if you take into context what's happened through the last couple of weeks and where things have been trending, but also how we got there was a little bit more on the surprising side. So first of all, let's talk about the actual games themselves and the scores. The Memphis Express defeated the San Diego Fleet 26-23. The Orlando Apollos remained undefeated, taking on the Salt Lake Stallions, and they defeated them 20-11. The San Antonio Commanders barely beat out the Birmingham Iron 12-11, and the Atlanta Legends got their first victory against the Arizona Hotshots 14-11. So two of our winless teams got their first victory, so congratulations to Memphis and to Atlanta. The Orlando Apollos remain now the only undefeated team in the Alliance of American Football. The Commanders have leveled out their record, and things are starting to bunch up a little bit. With that included, let's take a look here at how that breaks down as far as the standings are concerned. So taking a look at the standings here, in the Eastern Conference, it's pretty clear-cut right now. You still got the Orlando Apollos undefeated at 4-0. The Birmingham Iron with their first loss moved down to 3-1. But right now, there's still a separation between those two teams in the Memphis Express and Atlanta who got their first wins this week. As far as the Western Conference is concerned, those upsets, so to speak, over in the Eastern Conference mean that things have really bunched up. All these teams are kind of sitting right around the same spot. You've got San Antonio 2-2, San Diego 2-2, Arizona with 2 straight losses moves to 2-2. Salt Lake with their defeat moves to 1-3. All the teams are kind of bunched up together. There's a lot of parity in the Western Conference, but a lot of that comes at the expense of both Orlando and Birmingham over in the Eastern Conference. So now let's talk a little bit about how the actual games themselves and how we ended up at this spot. So looking at the San Antonio and Memphis game. So what this game came down to, Philip Nelson starting off early, kind of following up what they did in week 3. They had a good balance between the pass and the run, and it looked like San Diego had kind of figured their offense out. And at first, that seemed to be what was going on. And you can kind of see that as evidenced by the first quarter here. You know, they outscored Memphis 14-3, and it looked like Memphis was on its way to losing another game. Now, one thing that obviously was a big change that also took place last week was that Mettenberger took over for Hackenberg. In the second half of last week's game in week 3, Mettenberger was showing signs of being able to finally bring some life to the Memphis offense. So they had shown some improvement every single week, and it looked like they were trending towards it. Obviously, this got them where they wanted to be in terms of getting their first victory, but the way they got there was not the way that I would have expected. Philip Nelson ended up hurting himself in terms of some kind of a shoulder injury, and that resulted in Alex Ross taking over. And as you can see, even in the minimal action, Philip Nelson actually outthrew Alex Ross. Now, Alex Ross did come into the game and threw for a touchdown early on, but he was never able to really establish the offense in the same way, and things kind of slowed down for San Diego from that standpoint. Once they started to slow down, Memphis was able to kind of work their way back into the game. One area where I'm a little bit concerned as far as Memphis is concerned, even though they did end up getting the win, is that Mettenberger showed flashes of being able to spark the offense a little bit in last week's game. In the end, they did get the win, and they did come back to win this game. But one thing I did notice that concerned me a little bit was that while Mettenberger did make some of the throws down the stretch, it looked like he seemed to almost have less confidence with a full week of practice leading up to the game. So I'm curious if the offensive game plan, given that they actually prepared it with Mettenberger in mind, was somehow a little bit more conservative. It seemed to me that they were almost more free-flowing last week, and they were showing a little bit better. In the end, the result was what you would have wanted if you're a Memphis fan, but it is going to be interesting to see if they will actually allow Mettenberger to move the ball going forward. So he ended up throwing for 174 yards, and Zach Stacy and Sherman Batty were kind of limited. So only 39 yards for Stacy and 12 yards for Batty. So really not a lot of balanced offense, and I think that kind of led into the game moving as slowly as it did. One quick side note that I did want to throw in here was that Memphis actually did a really good job in terms of neutralizing Jaquan Gardner, and that was a major key, I think, in the balance that San Diego had on offense. So it's something that I didn't mention in the original video, so that's why I'm kind of doing a freeze frame here to show that to you. But at the same time, just bear that in mind that it was a grand total of 9 attempts for 6 total yards. Considering that Gardner was one of the few backs in the league thus far to have 2 100-yard rushing games, being able to neutralize him and minimize him to that degree, what also really was probably a major factor in allowing Memphis to stay in the game and in turn be able to take it out and win it in the fourth quarter. Overall, while it was kind of more of a conservative game plan, as I said, it did end up being an effective game plan. And more importantly, Zach Mettenberger was efficient. So realistically, there were no turnovers, which was huge, one thing that Christian Hackenberg had struggled with. And in reality, he completed 72%. So even though it wasn't for a ton of yards and not really an impressive stat line, the fact that he didn't give up the ball at all in terms of turnovers and was able to be efficient when he did make throws was enough. That kept them in the game, and the Memphis defense seems to have been showing improvement as games have gone on. So I think that's been really helpful for them as far as winning this game and coming back against San Diego. Now let's talk about Orlando taking on the Salt Lake Stallions. This is probably, which is interesting to say given that Orlando is undefeated, this is actually probably Orlando's most impressive performance in week 4 here. Even though they had obviously scored more points in other games, the fact that they were playing in Salt Lake in not ideal conditions, it was more of a snowy conditions there in Salt Lake, but they were still able to hang into the game and play more of a conservative game plan, despite the fact that the conditions didn't favor a more high-octane offense. They were still able to generate some offense. Garrett Gilbert was able to get 244 yards. They were able to rush on the ground. You've got three different backs that were able to get a little bit of yardage. Charles Johnson was still able to clear 100 receiving yards. And they basically were able to adapt their game quite a bit. And you can see here, Garrett Gilbert completed, it's almost 69% completion percentage, which is, it's going to get it done. It's enough. Even though they weren't able to produce the gaudy numbers, the conditions just didn't present themselves to that. So really all that they ended up doing was they were able to generate enough offense to keep them in the game and to eventually get them ahead. And at the same time, their defense played well enough to hold Salt Lake so that Salt Lake was forced to have to actually try to generate offense of their own, and they struggled to do so. It's being shut out in the first and fourth quarters, and it was probably Orlando's most complete game of the season thus far. One thing that would be concerning for the other teams is the fact that they were able to play in those more difficult conditions and were still able to do enough to win the game. So right now, that kind of gives them a bit of a psychological advantage in the other teams, where different teams in this league, being that it is a developmental league, at times the inconsistency as far as receivers dropping balls, as far as defenses struggling to kind of adjust and adapt, and then offensive lines also struggling to be able to protect their different quarterbacks, a team that already can show that they can generate offense, and while may not be as strong defensively, that was able to adapt a little bit, it is something for the other teams to keep in mind going into the future weeks in this league. Now, talking about the San Antonio Commanders and Birmingham Iron game, while the scoreboard itself wasn't a tremendously exciting, and to be honest, the game really didn't showcase very much, it was interesting in a few subplots. One thing that kind of continued on, and one thing that I've mentioned before, was that I had kind of some high hopes on Luis Perez because I saw flashes of what I thought could be pretty good quarterback play from him. But I think this game was another sign that they really are struggling to regress, and I'm going to show you some statistics afterwards, after we finish talking about the games, that would really lead me to be concerned about Birmingham going forward. Really what it came down to was, while San Antonio wasn't able to demonstrate a ton in terms of offense, they were able to do enough. And really what it came down to for them was the running game. So let me show you a little bit here. The key element for them was Kenneth Farrow II getting 142 yards on the ground. So really a very impressive performance as far as that's concerned. And you can see Logan Woodside with 106 passing yards. Not tremendously impressive. And it's something that may come into play in the future weeks, because if Johnny Manziel actually ends up playing in the Alliance of American Football, all indications are that he would be allocated to San Antonio. And Logan Woodside is not really acquitting himself very much. They were able to get the win, which is the most important part. But it doesn't look good if you really struggle to generate any kind of offense. Now, admittedly, Birmingham has demonstrated their defense has been tremendous this season, but it's not a good look when you basically have to rely almost entirely on the running game. The good part is they did get a great performance out of Kenneth Farrow, but you can see all the other offensive statistics were not really that great. The other element that I would say kind of worked in their favor a little bit was that they were able to win the time of possession game. So you can see here, they were able to have 33 minutes to 26 minutes from Birmingham. And the other aspect that I would say really, really hurt Birmingham in this, in addition to Luis Perez really still showing a lot of inconsistency, Brandon Ross was able to get a little bit done on the ground, but Trent Richardson, while getting another rushing touchdown, was only able to generate 15 yards on the ground. And I'll show you a statistic when we do the season stats so far for running backs. You're going to see that Trent Richardson has one statistic where he's really shining, and then overall in other statistics not looking nearly as good. But specifically in this game, 8 attempts, 15 yards for under 2 yards a carry, which isn't which isn't great at all, and that's not really going to get it done. And I did mention last week that that's something that was really kind of concerning me. At the same time, Luis Perez, under 50% completion percentage. Forget about the yards. Just the fact that you're not even completing 50% of your passes, and 50% of your passes isn't good either. Just offensively, Birmingham really is struggling. Even though their defense is keeping them in the games, eventually they're going to get punished in games like this, when they're just not able to generate any offense of their own without the defense kind of doing a lot of the work. So that's something to keep in mind going forward, and we'll talk about that when we look at the standings again. Last and certainly not least, the Atlanta Legends did get their first win against the Arizona Hotshots, 14-11. Again, kind of an ugly, low-scoring game. Really what it came down to was that Atlanta was able to produce just enough, while Arizona really struggled on offense in order to really generate anything. John Wolford was there, but he was largely ineffective. From the Atlanta standpoint, Aaron Murray was able to start the game when Matt Sims was actually injured. It's going to be interesting going forward if they're going to keep going with Aaron Murray, because he was able to produce a little bit in terms of passing yards, and also he was able to work with his feet and get 54 yards on the ground, actually leading the Atlanta team in rushing. I wouldn't want him to do that game by game, but it is nice that he has the ability to take off with the ball if that's what's necessary. A lot of what this game came down to is that even though Atlanta wasn't able to generate a lot, it was enough. And Aaron Murray, from my standpoint, did show enough that, being that they got the win, I would probably be inclined to let him have another start just to see if he can produce something with more snaps for the receivers. But it's kind of the same as Mettenberger, where the ineffectiveness of the starter is going to make you almost want to change things just to see a different look and just to see if it makes any difference for the offense. From Arizona's standpoint, it really came down to not being able to produce anything. Because as you can see, even though they did struggle, rushing-wise, receiving yards, sacks, and tackles, they actually led all the categories in this game. As far as time of possession was concerned, though, you can see it was really one-sided in terms of Atlanta, who was able to control the ball for most of the game. And at the same time, Arizona struggled in order to generate a lot of consistency. They did get a 100-yard rushing game from Jarrell Presley, which is good. That was a lot of the offense that they were able to produce, and they struggled to actually put any points on the board. Right now, John Wolford, the question is going to be if Wolford is still a little bit hurt from the back injury from last week. And if that carries over, then that's going to be a bit of a struggle for the Arizona team, who still needs to still generate some points. They do have a little bit of capability on defense, but realistically, they're going to need to score points if they're actually going to win games. Okay, now as promised, I did want to make another note about the Birmingham Iron before I moved on and take one more look at the standings. My biggest concern from the Birmingham Iron standpoint, as I mentioned, was really their inability to generate a lot on offense, and some of these numbers really make this pronounced. What you really need to pay attention to here is that they've only averaged 264 total yards per game. That's passing and rushing. It's not a good figure. And the reality is they've won 3 of their games almost entirely on the back of their defense. And the numbers become even more striking when you consider Trent Richardson leads the team after 4 games with 160 yards. 40 yards per game average. And at the same time, the bigger concern is this, and I'll show it to you because it shows really the main issue. So looking at Luis Perez, for the season itself, he's got a 56% completion percentage, which again, isn't the be-all and end-all, but it's not great. He's got 3 interceptions to 0 passing touchdowns. After 4 weeks, no passing touchdowns. And at the same time, if you look in terms of the offense, every single touchdown that has come from the offense has come off the back of Trent Richardson, 7 touchdown rushes. The problem is that even though that's a good-looking number in and of itself in isolation, when you look at under 2.5 yards per carry, all those rushes are coming in short yardage. So in reality, Trent Richardson isn't breaking any tackles, isn't really generating any additional yards for himself, and even though he's the biggest name of the league, especially as far as running backs are concerned, it's really a big concern that he isn't able to generate anything in terms of offense. They're just not finding a way to get down the field, whether it is to throw it out to Trent Richardson to try to do that and make him a bit of a receiver as well, to try to open up the field a little bit. And Luis Perez has really been regressing in terms of throwing into a lot of coverages. And a lot of those haven't been converted into interceptions, but it's very possible that as the weeks go forward, if that isn't improved in some way, that there could be more interceptions and it could end up hurting Birmingham. So even though they're still sitting at 3-1 right now, there's a very real possibility they could run off a couple of more losses if they don't find some way to generate offense on their own. So let's take a quick peek at what next week's games look like. Specifically, this first game here is going to be key because this is already on the Saturday game here. It's going to be Orlando taking on Birmingham. So potentially this could have been a battle of 2 undefeated teams, but with Birmingham's loss, it's still a kind of a battle for first place because Birmingham can match up records with Orlando if they're able to beat them. But at the same time, it's also possible for Orlando to take a 2-game lead. It's still early enough in the season that that's not necessarily going to seal it up for them, but being 2 games ahead with Birmingham kind of moving backwards could very well position Orlando well going forward. Now, as far as the next game here, Salt Lake taking on San Diego, right now these teams are still kind of jockeying for position. There really isn't anything major that's going to happen here that's going to shake anything up, but Salt Lake will want to try to even out their record a little bit, and San Diego is going to be really interesting to watch to see if Philip Nelson is able to come back and they're able to reestablish that offense they showed in week 3 in week 5 in order to try to, keep progressing forward. Going into the Sunday games, we have Memphis taking on Atlanta. Again, originally this was going to be a battle of 2 teams without a win to see who would get the first win. So right now it's just a matter of seeing which one of them can get the second victory to start moving closer to 500. They're still they've kind of fallen well behind what Birmingham and what Orlando are doing. But as I said, if Birmingham doesn't start kind of turning things around offensively, there's a very real possibility that Birmingham could come back towards them. They really need to be aware of that and try to get that win to try to keep themselves in contention. And that takes us to the last game for Sunday, which is going to be San Antonio taking on Arizona. Now, while both teams are 2-2 and they're going to be on the NFL Network here for the primetime slot, they got there in 2 completely different ways. Arizona's been sliding backwards, and they really need to get things reestablished with John Wolford and the offense to see if they're able to reconnect and try to get that win to reposition themselves back. San Antonio is trying to build off of that win, but they're really going to need to see something more from Logan Woodside, because I don't think you can realistically expect to get 140 yards from one back every single week. The last game wasn't exactly a dominant performance, and Logan Woodside does need to produce something for them, because we can see from the other examples in the league what happens when the quarterback is able to kind of produce in terms of the offense. Even though Aaron Murray wasn't exactly able to light things up, it was enough that he was able to generate some offense and be able to work through the air and a little bit with his feet to give Atlanta a little bit of a boost from where they had been. Much the same way, while Mettenberger wasn't lighting things up either, it was just the stability. Just understanding that the quarterback wasn't turning the ball over or making ill-advised throws at the worst possible time was enough to work with Memphis's progression to actually give them a victory, maybe a week sooner than I would have expected. But realistically, I'm hoping that if they allow Mettenberger to kind of open things up a little bit more, that in week 5, we're going to see a little bit more performance from them, especially since they're going to be playing an Atlanta team that's also still kind of in flux. So with that, week 5 should be really interesting to see where we end up with and how the jockeying for position takes place and what effect, if any, that has on the standings. Thanks very much for watching the video to the end, if you made it to the end. And before you go, I'm going to quickly, kind of plug our channel and also the podcast. So really, this channel is here to just kind of support our podcast. It's called the Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast, given the name of the channel. Obviously, if you're watching this video, you know that we do make videos from time to time. We call these Unnecessary Nonsense Pod Extras. Just a little something additional that we talk about, because we do like to talk about the Alliance of American Football. But on the podcast, we do have a segment where we do discuss the week's games a little bit. These videos tend to be a little bit more in depth, but we also talk about other sports. Right now, with a focus mainly on football and as well as a little bit on baseball. Right now, we're in the second to last video in our series looking at all the divisions in baseball. We're going to be talking about the National League East next, followed by the American League East to finish it off. You can obviously see the podcast on this channel because we will post the audio-only podcast, but you can also see us on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.